Promotional consideration paid for by the following.
O'Brien Seeds and Starts. Because no one knows hydro like Keiko.
Yo, what's up, man? This is Rome, Face Nagus, doing a random thoughts from the runabout. This one's a little bit different because, usually I got Cisco or Dax and Cisco behind me. But I've calmed in a friend and we're going to talk about this. You might remember him from a Technically Speaking that we had previously done, and we'd like to welcome him back to the show. And this is Edmund. Oh, I'm messing it up. Say your name for me, please.
Edmund Schluessel.
Schluessel. I don't know why that's so hard for me. I don't know. It's weird. Okay, so anyway, today's episode is something I've actually tried to do in the past before, and I had actually completed it, but for some reason, I was just like, there's something more that needs to be added to this. And I figured it out sort of ironically because the news that's going on in the States right now is laced with a lot of stories involving rapper, producer, music dude named Kanye West. And his words that are anti-Semitic and how that has basically brought about more of a anti-Semitic voice from the ether. Like, obviously, anyone that hates people in general is racist, prejudiced. That's not something that fits into the Federation at all, right? So it made me wonder, in this Star Trek mythos, I've been trying to do this Ferengi episode and about the perceived stereotypes of this group of people. And I was like, let me bring in another voice and let's have a dialogue about it. So without further ado, we're going to talk about the Ferengi and are they inherently anti-Semitic tropes? So, do you have an opinion on this? Like, have you thought about this? Is this something you went over?
Well, it's hard to give a definite yes or no answer to this because with the Ferengi, you have multiple people in charge of this narrative. You have the creation of the Ferengi. They're introduced very early in Next Generation with the intent that they're going to become the main villain of Next Generation. And then because of this dialogic process that always happens in Star Trek, there's this realization that actually they're not quite as menacing as they were intended to be. But then as we get into the launch of Deep Space Nine, you have a Ferengi character included in the main cast, played by a Jewish actor, and with a lot of the writing being done by Jewish writers, including by Ira Steven Behr. And so I think that there are elements of anti-Semitic tropes in the Ferengi, in the makeup, in things like their stature, in how they're initially presented, their association with a lust for gold. But Deep Space Nine, which is a very reflective series, one where the writers are looking back on the history of Star Trek and looking at reflectively at their own society, I think that they take that and they turn it into, they weave a lot of exploration of what Jewishness is and how it's perceived all through Deep Space Nine in multiple ways, not just through the Ferengi, but also through the Bajorans, and I think you can argue through the Dominion as well. So I think that, yeah, there are some anti-Semitic elements that are introduced in the original conception, but I think it turns into a really interesting conversation as we get into Deep Space Nine.
Right. So, like, superficially, I know that's one of the things that are often brought up would be like, okay, they have really large ears, right? And they're like, okay, that's
ears. They're short.
Right. The noses, would you say the noses, gold. Maybe?
The nose, yeah. There is a nose there is what's it called, a nose prosthetic that they always use for Ferengi actors. It doesn't look like the stereotypical depictions to me,
Right.
but I can see that there's a possible connection there.
The reason I
Remember,
say the nose.
we're talking about a multi-stage process with Roddenberry coming up with the Ferengi, but then that goes to Michael Westmore and the makeup team who have to come up with a practical character design.
Right. The reason I brought up the nose is when I was doing the research and reading for this, that one of the things that they would come back to would be the caricature of like Nazi Germany and how they would depict Jewish people, and they would always have like the very protruding nose, they were like,
Big
okay,
noses,
so the Ferengi nose, right, is supposed to be the it's supposed to be the nose. But let me ask you this about the ears though, because from what I've always read, the only reason their ears are huge is because Roddenberry didn't get his way of their like phalluses being huge. Like it was supposed to be like noticeably huge phalluses, like that, So with them substituting the ears for that, could you sort of say, or possibly like reason that away of like, okay, that might fit into why you might think it's a stereotype, but they didn't even want it to be ears, so probably not.
Well, a lot of this refers back, whether consciously or not, to stereotypes that have a medieval origin. So we're looking back hundreds of years, literally things that are depicted in the 11th, 12th century. And the big ears and the short stature are things that are depicted going back that far back. And these tropes are things that come up so frequently that they are easy to miss. Sure. Like a lot of the discussion about the the gnomes in Harry Potter, the gnomish bankers.
Now, not to cut you off, I'm not a Harry Potter fan, but I heard about that when I was researching this, and I had to go look it up, and I'm just like, oh no, that's definitely, there's no dancing around that.
Yeah, I think it was taken to a more explicit level in the movies as well.
Okay.
But then also, I used to play a game called Master of Orion 2, great space game. But then there's one alien race called the Nolams, and they wear skull caps, they have big noses, and their special ability is that they get a bonus to trade and anything to do with money.
Do you think the name was? Do you think the name was also supposed to be a hint since it rhymes with Golem?
Maybe, yeah. I hadn't thought about that, but possibly. But my point is, these stereotypes are so ingrained in Western society that it's possible to say, it's possible to think we want a character who will convey the impression of being greedy. We'll go with these images and not have any idea about their origin.
Right. I know one of the other things, sort of going away from the physical appearance, another one of the arguments that people use about the Ferengi to say that they feel like it's supposed to be a stereotype of Jewish people is the fact that their society is extremely legalistic, the way it's set up. And they were saying it's almost like a old school, Old Testament almost society with what I believe would have been the Pharisees, if I'm remembering that correctly. Do you pick up any of that, or do you see that being a hallmark?
I mean, I can see the argument in that Quark is always quoting the rules of acquisition, and I guess you could make a parallel to something like quoting Talmudic law in that. It isn't something that necessarily rings true as anti-Semitic to me. especially since it's something that's introduced later on. You don't hear about the rules of acquisition in the early Ferengi, you just hear about the idea of pursuing profit. I don't know. I can see the argument. I can see it also in things like the costume design, where there have been some influences from, I guess you could argue, from Middle Eastern robes. Um, at the same time, we know that there was a conscious influence from East Africa. The whole name Ferengi, the word Negus. These are things that are Ethiopian in origin.
Like, doesn't Ferengi mean like foreigner or something?
Yeah, yeah, it means foreigner through actually a big swath of the world, but Negus
Oh wow.
specifically a is an Ethiopian title for emperor.
Indeed, and I can't act like we didn't borrow. Like we borrowed the borrow from the borrow, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
um, definitely. And that's one of the things. Like, I'll save this for the end. I'll save it for the end. I had a thought, but I'll remember it. So, um, another thing they said was the treatment of women in Ferengi culture was reminiscent of Hasidism, if that's the way it's supposed to be pronounced. In the way in which like women aren't allowed to basically earn profit. Are you aware enough to speak on that, or do you know?
Not really. I mean, there's the reputation of Hasidic Jews being very conservative and very strict about gender roles. It's not a culture I'm intimately familiar with, though.
Got you. And I'm trying to think. Another thing that they mentioned was the funeral rites. They were saying that
Mm-hmm.
like the Ferengi funeral rites, barring autopsy, which we see displayed in TNG,
Mm-hmm.
um, specifically because then in DS9 we sort of find out further, you know. But as presented in TNG, they were like, okay, yeah, definitely the funeral rites are like wholesale the same as what we would ascribe in Judaism.
Well, a lot of cultures, you're not supposed to disturb the body in any way after death. Um, it is something that is important in Jewish culture, yes. The idea of keeping the body intact, though, is also something that comes up in Catholic doctrine.
Do you think it
Um,
would go ahead?
yeah, it's another area where, yes, it is a thing that some Jews do, but it is not necessarily a Jewish thing, if you get what I mean.
Right. And then we sort of discussed earlier, but and then some of the Ferengi have a distinctive head covering, which they never really tell you why, but I guess the assumption would be it has some type of religious significance.
Oh,
I don't know.
the thing that they wear on the back of their heads? Yeah,
Right.
that just means that they've been in that they're in the armed forces of the trade service or whatever. So Ferengi who are in some kind of service position where it like if they work on a starship
So
and
you're not an
flying a ship.
owner, basically.
Well, the starships that we see are basically free traders. Is the way that the world was built around that.
Right.
You see that Rom also wears one as a modified part of his uniform when he joins
Well,
the Bajoran militia.
do the captains wear them though? Like if you're a captain of a ship, because the way they sort of make it seem is the captains of
Mm-hmm.
Ferengi ships own that ship, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So
the
do the
Daemons
captains
wear
have
them.
them? Okay, they do. Okay.
If I remember correctly, yes.
Okay. So, do you think it would be more fair to say if you were going to accuse the Ferengi of a anti like being sort of an anti-Semitic walking trope, if that does
Mm-hmm.
apply, it would be TNG Ferengi as opposed to what we saw in Deep Space Nine?
Well, it's more so with the TNG Ferengi, yes. In Deep Space Nine, there's never a refutation of that exactly. Uh, there kind of is actually in Lower Decks, the way that they've discussed the Ferengi in that series. But in Deep Space Nine, there was much more desire to have continuity and say, we're starting from here. How can we use this starting point that TNG has handed us to tell an interesting story? Now, this is where I think you can start seeing a transformation of that image, because there are ways in which the character of Quark is quite highly stereotyped. But there is also, right from the beginning, there's this element in the portrayal where where Quark knows that he is being a stereotype, where that is something that he's performing. Where he's very aware that that is an image that he is supposed to project, or that he is compelled socially to project over what is often revealed to be a romantic heart. And we see this very early on in the series. What is that one episode of Deep Space Nine that is basically Casablanca? There's this Cardassian scientist on the station.
Yeah. When Garrick has the smooth line of saying she might need a tailor because her style's out of fashion on Cardassia.
Yeah. And so Quark is always that is the archetypal Quark story. That he looks like he's this hard-edged profit motive only businessman, and by the end of the episode, he's realized no, that's not who he is. He's going to make an exception in this case.
Yeah, no, for sure. And that's that's one of the things that about Quark that, and obviously, Armin, was a brilliant actor. Loved him since Buffy. Actually, Defense Nine might have been before Buffy, but yeah, definitely great actor. But that's one of the things I think if it's not him, I don't know they're able to do that. I don't know if they're able to get out of the box they're placed in on TNG. Because and that's another thing. From what you see in Deep Space Nine, it almost is like a refutation of TNG in that they almost act like any aggressive natured Ferengi is abnormal. Mm-hmm. When on TNG, all the Ferengis were sort of aggressive in the way they were dealing with the Federation. Specifically, the dude whose son felt like Picard was responsible for his son dying, and then when the guy kidnapped Troy and Riker and Laxwana. And then you don't really like when you see aggressive Ferengi on Deep Space Nine, they're seen as like the weirdo, was a Quark's cousin, the one Ferengi that likes to kill just to kill. To the point that when they do the Magnificent Ferengi episode, it's really hard for them to find like enough Ferengi willing to like do this, just because that's not what we do.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. It's always difficult having a conversation about national character or cultural character. It's an idea that has a half-life in anthropology. Like, there are people who think that the book Patterns in Culture is amazing. There are people who think it's just a reinforcement of 19th century stereotypes, and the anthropological community is still in hot debate about how much that actually means, about whether there is such an idea as cultural ideals that are recognized in any culture and universal. That is, however, the premise that Star Trek always works from whenever you see the Vulcans or the Klingons or whoever, is the idea that these are the premises of how a stereotypical Vulcan character or a stereotypical Romulan character acts. And you can,
but then they always show you the exception, like almost immediately.
They always show you the exception. but you need to know the baseline before you can talk about that meaningfully as an exception. And Quark being established as an exception means that that baseline was a thread all through TNG. And yeah, we do see Bach and, yes, the person in Menage a Troi who kidnaps the Troys. But we also see opportunistic Ferengi. We see like the ones who get trapped on the other side of the wormhole, the Ferengi who show up as scavengers later on. I forget the episode, but their ship gets stuck in a rift at one point.
Now, are you talking about Perfect Mate, where they try to like steal the they pretend their ship's messed up and try to steal what's her name? She's famous. She was Jean Grey in the X-Men. Yeah.
Yeah, that's another good episode, although the Ferengi basically exit that episode pretty early on. The one where Rascals, where some Ferengi freebooters take over the Enterprise. This was not something that was a major military operation. This is someone got together a couple of disused Klingon warbirds somehow. They're basically scavengers, and this is also the portrayal that they return to in Voyager, both in False Prophets, but also
Enterprise as well.
Yeah, where they're basically pirates. Of course, Voyager makes a point of not learning from Deep Space Nine, and Enterprise makes a point of not learning from anything. So I guess that you could say that those are returns to form for the returns to the TNG Ferengi. But there is that through line, I think, that they're not especially courageous. That they do. What's it? I'm blanking on episode titles tonight. Peak Performance. They turn and run away almost immediately. They're brought in as the source of conflict in the final third of the episode. But then, when they're tricked, they give up and leave. So, yeah, I get what you're saying about how the aggressors are the exception, but at the same time, they're never that aggressive. And, yeah, Bach and what's his name from Menage a Troi are portrayed as being exceptional. Bach loses his command twice because his crew thinks that he's doing something unprofitable.
Definitely. So yeah, man, like I guess in the conclusion that I've sort of come to when I look at the Ferengi is if they were supposed to represent something, to me, they would represent like the quote unquote free market economy, if it literally was like as a libertarian would imagine it, I guess you would say.
Yeah. Yankee traders.
Exactly, right? Like you literally have to pay to get into their church. Like you have to put money in for them to open the doors. Like the literal church building, not even the Grand Exchequer, I believe. Yeah, it just seems like your worth is completely based off your worth. Like how much you have, that's what you're worth. And I don't know. It just seems like if anything, that's capitalism without any moral checks or balances. But at the same time, it doesn't make sense for an uber capitalistic society to not let 50% of the population like contribute to the profit.
Well, if capitalism was rational, it wouldn't be capitalism anymore. Capitalism intrinsically there's this basic contradiction, right? On the one hand, capitalism wants to exploit the working class because it wants to extract wealth, and the way to extract wealth is to get people to produce things that are of value, but then not receive the full value of what they produce. But then, because of the nature of capitalist production, you create these situations where people are working together in a factory or working together in a mine or in a school or whatever, and so solidarity must intrinsically emerge. And so the capitalists have to create artificial divisions within their working class in order to keep people in line. And look at the level of division that is imposed on working people in the real world today, where we have artificial barriers of nationality, artificial barriers of gender, artificial barriers of race. In many places, these things are enforced by law. All these things persist so that capitalist systems can continue. If you want to take it to a peak of irrationality, look at South Africa during the days of apartheid, when 90% of the population had diminished rights, where there was legal discrimination against practically everyone in that society, where it would have been much, much better for the economy, even from a classical capitalist perspective, to have given up on that. But where to maintain the system for the wealthy, they had to keep that system of exploitation in place, where they had to keep apartheid going, or else the only other option was basically, honestly, the white settlers of South Africa are lucky there was not an enormous massacre at the end of apartheid.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Because and that's one of the things that coming to the U.S. for a second. That's one of the things that's always crazy to me is if you look at the history of the United States of America, how many massacres have you seen that were a minority group massacring like white people, right? Now, if we flip that, we can, read off a long list of things that have happened. I'm not saying it's never happened reverse, but I guarantee you it's not more than like probably 10 times from the inception of America as a country to like today. Obviously, when it was, settlers and the indigenous people here, yeah, I'm sure the indigenous people did, wipe out some settlements and whatnot. But as far as the United States of America existing, that's never really happened. But if you look at the narrative, a lot of people that haven't had any interaction with people of different races or different ethnicities will assume and feel an inherent threat or danger to them, when it's like, well, that's not historically what happens. Like, so I mean, I definitely can see how your actions and the way you do things don't necessarily jibe with the reality on the ground. I know one of the reasons why on the South, speaking of South Africa, one of the reasons why they gave up their nukes, from what I've read, was the fear that when this all came tumbling down, you were going to have a bunch of Africans with control over nukes. And they were just like, no, we got to dismantle the program like before the regime collapses because that's a nightmare. But like, why would you just assume they would be more prone to use these nukes than the clerk or whoever was in charge, before the fall of the regime? So yeah, I could definitely, that makes sense as far as like why they would have these rules in place that work against what they claim their aim is, which is like full capitalization and marketization. Yeah, and another thing is Quark from time to time, like for instance, when he's talking about when they go back in time and he's talking about, oh, y'all test nuclear bombs on your own planet. Like the Ferengi have never done that, and the Ferengi never did slavery. And you're just like, wow, like you would think if it was a fully capitalized system, at some point you would just view people as commodities, which they do, just not to the extent of chattel slavery. Well, I mean, you maybe can make an argument the women are chattel slaves if they can't leave the house or wear clothes.
Yeah, and it's entirely possible that Quark has simply not reflected on the character of his own society. It's something that I think about a lot because I have an enthusiasm for the 1920s and the history of that period.